today with Richard Kerbaj. Richard, how are you?
Very good.
Good.
It's good to be here.
Good to have you here. We had some tech issues the other day.
Previously, yeah, which I've totally blamed on you.
I take full responsibility.
Yeah.
I'm not letting you down. BAFTA award-winning filmmaker, investigative journalist. How do you describe yourself?
A storyteller. Literally, this is it. Because if you were to look at what I do in the context of my previous work as a reporter for a newspaper or a foreign correspondent, and my current work as a filmmaker, drama, documentaries, and also a book, an author is the best way to sort of talk about it. It's storytelling. It's about creating content. It's about connecting with people in every one of the stories that I tell, because I'm in the realm of non-fiction.
Yeah.
Every story requires A, research, and B, connecting with people to obtain information. So,
sorry.
Yes, so that's kind of how I go about it. So when I say storyteller, I'm a storyteller, but also I'm a people's person.
Right.
And because I'm a people's person, I like writing about people.
Yeah.
And so I derive all of my content either directly from people, indirectly through archives, from also people.
So let me ask, kind of, as you're saying that, and I think I'm a non-fiction storyteller.
Yes.
We live in a world now where, like, the truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
How important is credibility, and how to deliver credibility and kind of make me understand the truth is?
Well, it's paramount, because right now, every person out there, and this is not to be disparaging about people, but everyone thinks they are a journalist. So if you go to Twitter, for instance, everyone's filing copy, sending their tweets. It's called X now, right? But everyone's tweeting about the most contemporary issues. They're either tweeting analysis, they're tweeting opinions about situations that are taking place or that have taken place. They're giving you constant updates about the most recent conflict. Look at the Middle East, for instance. It's become such a divisive issue. And then when it becomes an issue relating to geopolitics, everyone's delving in. The issue with that is that's fine if you want to do a read through of the cross section of views to get a sense of what the public is feeling, so the public sentiment. That's a great speaker's corner, as it were, right? To borrow from. This is kind of a platform where you could go and but if you start taking things there from the general writers or contributors at face value, that becomes quite problematic. So I think there is still a reliance on mainstream media, on what they call legacy media, and people refer to legacy media these days in a pejorative way, as if somehow legacy media is generating views and perspectives that are just there to drive their own personal agendas and magnify their commercial interests.
Yeah.
But it exists for a good reason. Of course, there's a competition now between, and not just a competition, but an ongoing rivalry between the legacy media and these new forms of media.
Yes.
Every podcaster out there wants to pontificate about issues. Every blogger, every tweeter, everyone wants to share their perspectives. Everyone wants to be heard. And I think amid all the chaos and the static, you need to establish, what the real information is. And
how to do that? I mean, how does the lay person? How do I?
Well, I think expert opinion matters. You don't just become an expert at something by mistake. You could, if you want to become an immediate expert and just pontificate online, you do exactly that. Oh, I think this has happened. But if you actually want to become an expert, then you have to really delve into it. So to give you an example about FVEY and the way I went about this. So I tried to take the easy route to begin with, because I thought on the back of the last film they had made, which was the Hunt for Jihadi John for HBO and Channel 4, it was combined financing, and I made this film and it was very successful and it made a huge amount of impact. And while making that film, I realized that there is a great story to tell about the interactions between intelligence officials across the Atlantic, because they went about their operations differently. The British, for instance, were a lot more considered and measured in their approach. They wanted to sort of put law ahead of everything else. The Americans tend to be a bit more fast and loose with the operations. They just want to get the bad guy.
Yeah.
And so you need them to kind of work together. And it's important to have dissenting voices in those kind of situations. You want people to challenge each other, not to kind of, otherwise you end up with problems like we did, say, in the lead up to the Iraq War. There weren't enough people challenging the leadership, hence why they based their invasion on false intelligence, as we know now. But just going back to that point about connecting with people to do the research is such an important thing. I seek out expertise. So if I'm talking about Five Eyes, well, I needed to really delve into it. I couldn't. To do it as a documentary would have been much easier to begin with, because I just sit there and ask a question, people will say something. But I discovered that there is no book. No one knew all the points of the Five Eyes, not even the Five Eyes leaders, because they knew some stuff about. Of course, they knew about their own histories. Yes. But there are more than 14 intelligence agencies within this alliance. No one knew when it actually began, because the actual Five Eyes as a construct is not based on a legally binding document. It started in 1956, initially with the view to combating Soviet extremism and the Soviet threat and the communist threat. But then the end of the Cold War came, and they found themselves at a sort of loose end. And it didn't find its purpose again and repurpose its operations until September 11. And then it becomes a sort of a war on terror. And then they had to sort of evolve over time. Now, no one could talk about when the whole thing began. So I traced the roots of the Five Eyes back to the late 1930s, when MI5 had identified a threat against a US military official. And they'd identified the threat because they had been given information about this hairdresser in Scotland, this woman who's of British origin, Scottish origin, but who'd lived in Germany for roughly, I think, 20 years or more. And she had returned to the UK because she said that following the First World War, she was being kind of mistreated. Okay. That was in her head. Yeah. Anyway, she was recruited by the Nazis. And so when she returned with a view to conducting spy operations. And what's fascinating about her as a character, because we always think about these great big things that happen in the intelligence world. Well, most of those things are happening based on their reactions to something small. And this is a hairdresser who specialized in perms, who was obsessed with thriller novels, and who was drawn to the concept of spying because she thought that it would be kind of cool. So she started distributing information to the Nazis, and she became what's called a cutout. So essentially, the Nazi spies in New York would send her something. She would remove, in the way of a letter, communication. She would remove that letter from the envelope, repackage it in another envelope, address it, and send it through. Okay. So she could be cut out. And when MI5 discovered this, they started monitoring her letters. Seal them, you prise them open, have a look at them, take pictures, put them back in, and eventually they discovered this tip regarding a threat against a US military official. Now, at the time, there were no direct links between MI5 and the FBI. Everything went through the embassy. So they decided to tip off the FBI via the embassy. And in so doing, they essentially prioritized saving someone's life over their own investigation, which is a huge thing for intelligence agencies, because intelligence agencies are driven by self-interest first. Always. So in this case, they thought, we need to tip them off because there's a risk to life. But at the same time, they figured there's a potential here to kind of work with these guys. And it was on the back of that first interaction that the FBI and MI5 built a bilateral intelligence cooperation agreement that wasn't even written. And that essentially became the bedrock for what would later become the Five Eyes 18 years later.
The amazing thing to me is you're telling that story is around the fact that that's all about kind of the human interaction with each other. So, going back to X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, and I think even more so, we're now living in the world of AI and going there. I think, I go back to the question I almost asked you beforehand, is as a layperson, is like, how do I know what to trust? Like, if I'm not seeing you face to face, sitting in a room with you, what kind of should I treat everything cynically, or is that a bad way for human?
I think that's not a bad start at all. I think you need to be cynical to an extent, because being cynical is being questioning. Being questioning ensures that the information that you're reading and taking on is reliable information.
Okay.
Now, human beings tend to be biased in their views, and they tend to read, generally speaking, people read things that reinforce their own thinking.
Yeah.
So you almost need to read across the whole spectrum. You want to read about the Middle East? Well, read both sides, and then come to some sort of an agreement in your head. You want to read about
why is the world? Why are we more kind of definite in our divisiveness?
Well, I think that's largely because of the politics that we're existing in at the moment. So if you think about the way that Trump really Trumpified and changed the scene in 2016 when he came in, and then 2017, 18, and so on, he came in on the basis of reinforcing the division and expanding the gulf that exists between the right and left.
Yeah.
And then other nations kind of followed suit. I mean, look what happened in Britain with conservatives and the way they went about running their operations. Yeah. Now that's a strategy that they've taken, and with every strategy there is a setback.
Yeah.
Of course, there was the advantage with the Brexit strategy that they set out, saying 300 million a week we're going to be saving for the NHS. Well, I haven't seen that 300 million yet. No one has. Right. So there's one thing. The other thing is if you're dividing people, and I think politics is quite divisive. I mean, politicians need to be re-elected.
Yeah.
If everything's driven through that perspective, then you're eventually going to have these splinters in society. This is not a new thing. This has happened for decades, if not for centuries, but particularly more so now because isolated voices, or voices that had been once isolated, are now being projected.
Yeah.
Fringe perspectives are being given a disproportionate amount of attention. So if you had a fringe perspective once upon a time, no one would hear from you. Now you could go online and say something controversial, and suddenly you will draw in a massive crowd. And I think there is a lot of that baiting going on. And in so doing, a lot of people are doing it for clickbait. I'm not sure how many people online actually believe in their views. Some of them do, but some of them are doing it because they want to be controversial. Everyone wants to be heard. Everyone wants to be famous, kind of thing. There is that real shift in society, which is very strange. And they don't want to do it based on real work that they've done, because it's very difficult to sit down and research for 3 years, doing 12 hours a day, getting no recognition, and then figuring out a way through a story. It's just much easier to say, oh, well, this is...
So I think coming full circle back to you, I think almost my last question to you then, okay, everything you just said, which kind of we can absolutely discuss, and kind of how important is your role then as a non-fiction storyteller? Is now more important than ever, and kind of to make sure that the voices of the whole picture are being heard?
Yeah. I think the importance of my role is something that other people need to determine. But the importance for me in that role is to ensure that I scrutinize the information that I'm going through, corroborate the material that I'm seeing, question authorities who are in charge of operations. And because I write about and research areas relating to national security, intelligence agencies, their entire operation is to remain secret. Yeah. They're not out there to seek transparency for the sake of transparency. Yeah. They seek transparency with an end goal in mind. So I need to sort of get ahead of that end goal. Yeah. For instance, there was this conference that's been going on for the past few days in San Francisco. Why are they doing that? Yes, there's a great threat from communist China, and the Chinese are stealing IP. Mm-hmm. They are stealing medical, military, technological research. Well, the Five Eyes steal as well. Yeah. They co-opt, they manipulate, but they do it a different way. And I think what they were hoping to do with this is to illustrate that there is a legal framework that binds the Five Eyes in a democratic setting compared to the way that the Chinese operate, where they're completely running operations without any consideration, and in fact with complete disregard for the law, both domestic and international laws, with a complete disregard for civil liberties, for human rights, and they just get what they want. So the FBI has just revealed in the past 48 hours that they've got 2,000 live investigations on threats from China. In fact, they're saying that every 12 hours they open up a new investigation.
Right.
In the UK, 20,000 people were approached through social media by Chinese government with the hope of recruiting them or getting them on board. So they're constantly trying to steal, and it's become such an epic scale thing. So going back to the point about why did the intelligence agencies feel that it's important since 1956 for the first time to come out and all be sort of united together in the open, and it's because they realized that without getting some kind of a buy-in from the public and being seen as transparent, they're not going to be able to work alone, because we're in an age now where people are a lot more questioning, where companies are a lot more resistant to just cooperating with intelligence agencies because they think, well, listen, you've got a lot of baggage. Even those who know very little about intelligence agencies will question the way they operate, because these guys collectively, as a Five Eyes, well, they've been involved in a lot of controversies, from ones that we've heard about, recently, Guantanamo Bay, the torture methods that were conducted, the surveillance operations that were being run by them, which were exposed by the Snowden affair, and which they then had to deal with, and they've had to kind of change their operations, and they've had to make sure that everything's done within the bounds of the law. To things that were more historical during the Cold War, when say the FBI and the CIA were running operations against their own citizens. So there is a lot of suspicion around the way intelligence agencies operate. So you take all of that and then you put yourself in my role and you go, well, shit, how do I take these people at their word? So I've got to really do the research, then interview some of the people, unpick what they're saying, try to corroborate it, which is quite tough, because if you're getting something that's single sourced, well, how do you corroborate that? So then you have to make sure that you trust the person you're speaking to. You trust that you're not being misled by a person whose essential job is to mislead in some cases, because they do everything with self-interest in mind. And so that's the kind of dance that you have to do. So going back to the point about how important my role is, well, it's for others to determine, but I know how important my role is for me in the context of doing the research.
Richard, absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.
It's like critical thinking and everything about that.
Yeah.
It's so important. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks. Brilliant.